Welcome, everybody. Thank you. Happy Sunday. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Greg Epstein. I am the Humanist Chaplain at Harvard University and the Executive Director of the Humanist Hub. And you're our guests today, and we're delighted to have you.
People ask me why I just wrote this book on why is there so much bad writing out there and how can we make it better. And I tell people, well, after writing a book about World War, genocide, rape, torture, and murder, I decided to write a book about some really controversial topics like fused participles and the Oxford comma. But there is a tenuous thread, and I think Greg has drawn it out, which is just a rationalist view of all things. That is, how do you, in making choices on how to do things, whether it's the conduct of your everyday life or what institutions should we foster, what values should we promote, or how to craft stylish prose, one should think, one should reason. And there are many grounds for following dogma in cases where reason would lead to a far better outcome. One of them, and one common thread between these two apparently disjoint books, is a kind of denial of the kind of cynicism and pessimism about the younger generation that is a common thread. That one of the things I always hear when I say that I'm writing a book about writing and language is, isn't it terrible what the young people are doing to the language with their Twitter and their Facebook and their texting and their instant messaging, and they just write in smiley faces and little abbreviations, and isn't the language going to go to the dogs because of what young people do? And I also hear about violence. Oh, they play video games and first-person shooter, and they don't, they watch violent entertainment. And despite the fact, of course, that as the popularity of video games soared, the actual rate of violence in real life plunged. And in fact, this generation is by far the least violent, most responsible, most self-controlled by any measure. Teenage pregnancy, drug use, street crime, nonviolent crime, violent crime. The people who are in their teenage years now are far better than our generation was in our prime by any measure of social responsibility, and probably the most since the 1950s, if not before. So there's partly a common thread is an unwillingness to indulge in a kind of disease of middle age, which is to confuse changes in yourself with changes in the times, and changes in the times with moral decay. As you get older, you start to notice things and care about things and be more sensitive to the way things go wrong. And instead of saying, oh, well, I'm more cognizant of danger and error and folly, you think, well, I've stayed the same and the world has gotten worse. I think that is a habit that we should be aware of as we age and that we should distance ourselves from.
And the first thing that I thought of when I heard the question was a story, a personal story. When I was a graduate student in philosophy at Princeton, it used to strike me that the way we discussed and interpreted Wittgenstein had a certain familiarity to it. There was a certain kind of, I think the working premise was that he's very hard to understand, but if we could just figure out what it is that he's saying, we would know the truth. And of course his style inspires that. He's very apodictic, and he's very oracular, and subject to interpretation. And it struck me as very funny because it was so very familiar to what I had left behind me in leaving my Orthodox Jewish upbringing and fleeing to philosophy for rationality. Because, of course, the way that we were approaching Wittgenstein was just the same way that my relatives approached the Torah and the Talmud. It's very hard to understand what it means. It's subject to a great deal of interpretation. But if we could just figure out what it is they're saying, we'll know the truth. Which is to say that the irrationalities of religion often duplicate themselves in the secular world. I don't think there are any sacred secular writings. That's why I love secularism.
I don't think that it's true that poetry is so difficult or inaccessible. Maybe people make a comparison between poetry and things that are designed to have mass audiences. And I also disagree about a line between devotional poetry and secular poetry. Some of my favorite poems are Christian. And indeed, as the beautiful reading from Dante brought out, I, an extremely secular Jew, spent a lot of energy translating what some people call a Christian epic. When I did that favorite poem project, I had no budget for publicity whatsoever, and it was not a poll. I asked people to please write a few sentences, to write some sentences about a poem they loved. And there was no advertising budget. I would just mention it whenever I was interviewed. It was a print interview. I'd say, "Will you print our card?" And the card was in bookstores and libraries that I visited. We got 18,000 responses. And if you go to favoritepoem.org, you will see the construction worker talking very cogently about Whitman and reading Whitman aloud. You'll see the Chinese-American immigrant kid in Atlanta reading Emily Dickinson's I'm Nobody, Who Are You? Quite well. So I don't think that poetry is necessarily pitiable. I remember that years ago I was interviewed and somebody, this is my proudest response I ever gave to a question. They said, what do you think about this? Newsweek says in a big front story, poetry is dead. And I'm so pleased with myself. I said, well, let's have a race. Let's see which dies first, Newsweek or poetry. I think that I just quoted my own best moment.
I think stories are really important. I think it's one of the most human things we do. It's everything that I had said. I think about it all the time. It's been a huge part of my life, and now that I'm older, I look back and I can see how my storytelling urge really was my coping mechanism. In fact, I'll just tell you one thing that just happened at Thanksgiving last week. And it isn't even that great, but it's just so typical of my mother. My mother, we had 16 people at the Thanksgiving dinner in my home outside of Chicago, and my mother stood up and said, "I've bought gifts for everyone, but only the men," which is so typical, and because I couldn't think of anything for the women. And what I bought you all as your Thanksgiving gift for me is some socks, and then she held up a bag of socks. I got this on sale at Macy's, and I'm passing it around the Thanksgiving table, and everyone should take out a pair of socks they like. There's 3 colors there. And it was so confusing and bizarre. My brother-in-law, Tsuyoshi, who barely speaks English, who lives in Japan, didn't know what was going on. He took one of a pair of socks. He thought we were going to start playing sock puppets or something. What is even happening? And he's never been to Thanksgiving in America. It was we pass around the socks, only for the men. And then, oh my God. Okay, so yeah, okay, this feels good right now. I feel really good. But anyway, so that's really how I learned to tell stories. It was really my family, which I felt like they were just giving me so much material. It's sometimes I would look at people and think, in my family and think, don't do this because I have to tell someone about it. And you don't want me to tell them about it, but now I have to, because that is crazy, what you just said. Okay.
Thank you so much.